The stories that I told you just now are stories from early points in the age of open. They're stories about change. They're stories about risk. They're stories about science, about taking a chance. They're stories about massive conservatism. And for me, they're stories about failure of leadership, my own failure of leadership. They're stories about trying to figure out how to get someone to change and failing, which is incredibly annoying. It's annoying to fail when you have such good ideas. It's annoying to fail when you are sure that if people went along with you, things would be so much better. How do we get people to change? How do we get them to go along? How do we get people to change at a university, at a place so painfully, almost embarrassingly conservative as a university? What is it about intellectuals? How can we get people whose lives are about ideas to understand that ideas should be given away, that there's satisfaction from participating in the flow of ideas, that ideas don't lose value from being shared, they actually gain value from being shared? How can I help students and colleagues understand that hoarding ideas is yesterday's model and that giving them away is today's? Well, my own failures in these stories that I just told you about, and many more, in getting people to join me, led me several years ago to conclude that change is completely impossible. So just because everything's changed doesn't mean anything's different, right? I did realize along the way that there's one thing people resist even more than change, and that's coercion. That strategy isn't going to get you anywhere. Now, change really is completely impossible, except in one situation, and that's the situation in which it's really easy. This is my own conclusion from my own experience. It seems to me that the only time change can actually succeed is when it's self-motivating, self-motivated. And that's what I wasn't doing, at least with that student, at least with that colleague. I was trying to convince them with my arguments about why they should use an open archive, why they should make their research openly available. I was trying to convince my colleague with my arguments why he should publish, and that was a completely wrong strategy. It doesn't lead to self-motivation. It's perceived as coercion. It is resisted. So I tried to figure this out, and I thought, okay, maybe instead of making arguments and making claims, I should just start asking questions. So instead of saying, it's really important for you to use the archive, I should instead say, how would you like to distribute your work, right? Instead of talking about the importance of refinancing our Center of Excellence, I should say, well, how do you think we'll get through the midterm evaluation? So in other words, I would say to these guys, well, here's the goal. How should we get there? Well, that also turned out to be equally disastrous and didn't get me anywhere. It was the wrong approach. It was the wrong question, right? When I am in a leadership position and I go in and I say, how should we do this? It's either a disingenuous question. I don't really mean it. I'm just trying to trick you into going along with me. In other words, I already know. Or else, I really don't know. I'm just completely clueless, and I go in and I say, how should we do this? And neither of those options suits me very well when I'm in a leadership position. Now that just doesn't work. That approach, that question was the wrong question. But there is a different question. There's a different question we can ask, and it's a much, much better one. It's the question that leads to engagement. It's the question that leads to self-motivation. And it's the question that can lead to change. Instead of starting with how, good leadership starts by asking why. And you have to do that every time with everyone. You ask people why we should podcast, and that leads to a vision that they themselves have come up with. It leads to motivation. It leads to an understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. When we focus on why, we go into a process with our colleagues where we can carry out deep reflection. We can engage. We can motivate. We can involve them not just in the practical issues of how, but in the strategic issue of identifying what's worth doing and why. If you focus on why, people get their own answers. which leads to self-motivation, which, as I said, I think is the only way I've discovered to get people to change. Once you've dealt with why and a vision has emerged that people share, then how is a piece of cake. It's nothing more than the nuts and bolts of implementation, and since everybody shares the vision and really wants to get there, they'll figure out how. So if you keep your eye on the vision, then implementation is not a problem that lets us write off what we really want to do. It's just the nuts and bolts of it. We'll figure it out. So that could be the end of my story. How do we implement change? Well, coercion doesn't work, especially in academia. Changing coercion into questions like, how could you do this when I've already decided what this is? How could you get on board with my project? Those questions aren't really any better. If you start with why, you motivate people. And if you manage to motivate people, you're halfway home and more. So that's my only strategy. So I could just stop right here, but I have more time, so I won't. Instead, let me take a few minutes and just speculate a little bit on what it would mean in the context of podcasting, the context of getting colleagues, students, universities to get on board with podcasting. What would this approach mean? What are the why questions to ask? And I'll suggest a few of those. Of course, I'm not going to suggest any answers because my answers don't matter. My answers don't matter. What matters is your answers so that you know what your vision is. And once you have your answers, then what are you going to do? Are you going to go home and tell your colleagues what your answers are, what your vision is? No. The only thing you can do is go home and ask those same why questions to your colleagues. You have to go home and you have to facilitate a participatory immersion of a vision. And that vision is not going to be identical to yours, but if you set up the process right, it'll be close enough that you can live with it. So here's a few why questions that I have about podcasting, but you can make up your own. So we could start with something really simple, like why do we want more podcasting? Or we could go up a level and say, why do we need to improve teaching? Or we could go up even a level from that and say, why are you teaching? Why am I studying? Why is it valuable for a society to invest in education, and what would that mean to invest in education? How should that look today? Why do we need to make teaching and learning more stimulating and more engaging? Why can podcasting satisfy educators' passion for teaching? Or here's one from a specific case. Why is MIT doing what it's doing? I'm sure you all know about the Open Courseware initiative, lectures, lecture notes, everything online. What has that done for MIT? MIT is now the university of the world. Every university has faculty members who use OpenCourseWare from MIT to prepare their own materials. Students all over the world are being educated indirectly by MIT. It's a brilliant and impressive positioning that they've done. Now, how is podcasting the answer to these kinds of questions? Is this really where the action is? What is the competitive advantage that an institution achieves by starting to podcast? Why would podcasting feed the broader goals of an institution? I think you have good answers to these questions, but the context has to be set. The vision has to emerge through a process, not by edict. Now here's one more from me to you about podcasting, which you can turn into your own kind of why questions. My question about podcasting is this. Is podcasting a totally crazy idea? Or is podcasting just not crazy enough? Maybe this whole discussion should be taken up a level. Where are we in Norway with our kvalitetsreform? What are the big questions about the way we're doing education here? Which trains have left and which ones are still in the station? When you think about these questions, when you try to formulate those why questions, don't make the mistake that I made with my colleagues in the 90s and the early noughties. You have to respect the fears that we have. You just heard about some of those. Right? People are afraid that students will want to come even less to their teaching. Remember what kind of people choose to go into a career as a teacher, right? Teachers like to be around young people. They like to facilitate discovery. You have to let them enjoy that and not let this be a fear. Learning is not a transfer process, it's a guided discovery process. And I became an academic because I want the pleasure of witnessing that discovery. So given these fears, you also have to ask not what podcasting costs, for example, but what are you willing to pay, for example, to address those fears? Could you tie podcasting and flexibility as students with a renewed commitment to participate in classroom experiences? Right? If your line in this whole discussion is that you care about education, you better be credible when you say that. That's what my colleagues are afraid of, right? That's what those of you who want to push this line have to know and have to think about and have to respect and have to ask yourselves, how are you going to deal with that? But you can't answer their fears. You have to get them to think about a vision, and you have to do it in a way, if you want to, that podcasting is part of that vision. The whole history of education is a history of opening up. It's a history of increased access. That's the offer of podcasting. I know that. You know that. If you want others to know that, should you tell them why this is a good idea? No. You should not tell them why this is a good idea. You should ask them. That's the key to getting them to change. Just ask them why. Thanks.